In our first video, we thought about what constituted a divine right absolutist, and then we began to examine the kingship of Louis XIV to see whether he truly deserves such a lofty reputation. If we take his cultivation of art and propaganda at face value, then it would certainly appear that Louis scaled Olympian heights. But we also saw last time how much of Louis's kingship was actually built on compromise and consent rather than on absolute control, especially when it came to the privileged nobility upon whom the king relied. Whilst Louis undoubtedly presided over a changing of the guard, with the warrior nobility of yesteryear giving way to the bureaucratic robe nobility, it certainly didn't signal an abandonment of war as a principal instrument of foreign policy. The Salon de Mars depicted his great victories in war and would serve as a chastening reminder to his successors of exactly what was expected of a true Bourbon monarch. Indeed, Louis's fondness for war was another central pillar in his bid to rule as a true absolutist. Louis XIV saw the pursuit of la gloire in purely dynastic terms, and he wasn't afraid of wielding his power over his enemies, as Alexander the Great had done. Such extensive and aggressive military ambition has led some modern commentators to portray Louis XIV as a 17th century Adolf Hitler, hell-bent on dominating the European continent. The charge sheet doesn't make for flattering reading, especially when one considers how he spent most of his reign in a host of destructive continental wars against the Dutch, the British, and the Spanish Habsburgs. We should also remember that he muzzled the Parlement and openly persecuted religious minorities. But to portray Louis as hegemonic is to misunderstand the situation he inherited, and it serves to downplay the very real threat that was posed to him by various grand alliances over the course of his reign. Louis admitted on his deathbed that he had loved war too much, but it wasn't war in and of itself that Louis loved. Rather, it was the pursuit of la gloire. The direct English translation is evidently glory, but it went beyond that to assume more of a personal, dynastic focus. This was principally about honour, or what D.L. Smith refers to as a subtle blend of fame, honour, and magnanimity. Thus, Louis went to war with the Spanish Habsburgs in the late 1660s over his wife's inheritance. He went to war with the Dutch in the 1670s and against the League of Augsburg in the 1680s. The first decade of the 18th century and the last years of Louis's life saw France engaged in a tumultuous struggle with the Grand Alliance of The Hague in what became known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Some historians, such as Reinhard Hatton, have argued that Louis was not seeking to radically shift the balance of power in Europe, but that his ambitions were primarily defensive and were designed to bring security to his eastern frontier and to prevent Burgundian encirclement. Louis undoubtedly made mistakes, and the Peace of Utrecht in 1714 that brought the War of the Spanish Succession to a close clearly marked the limits of French adventurism under Louis XIV. It could even be argued that a subtle yet significant shift was starting to occur in the last years of Louis's life. Victories for the Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim in 1704 and Ramillies in 1706 reflected the growing power of Britain's constitutional monarchy, and by the early 18th century, French parlementaires were looking across the Channel with a degree of envy at the powerful English Parliament and the capacity of a limited constitutional monarchy to sustain the extensive costs of war and promote economic growth through the newly established Bank of England. Indeed, in 1706, a genuine solar eclipse took place the day after a Franco-Spanish army was humiliated at the siege of Barcelona. This was widely interpreted as the eclipse of the Sun King and the end of the Grand Siècle. It also proved to be a gift to propagandists. You can see this poem, which you might want to consider as a potential source in your NEA. The conquests Anna by her chiefs has won, eclipse the glories of the Bourbon sun. Her rising lustre spreads as his declines, and faintly, like the setting day he shines. Her fleets and armies o'er the world convey her fame and triumph over the tyrannic sway. She vindicates the cause of injured kings, and clips the Gallic cock's presumptuous wings. This satirical poem, so evidently underscored by English triumphalism, is clearly a form of propaganda. But the Francophobia that it trades in was driven by more than general hostility to a wartime enemy. From 1685, England had been receiving French Huguenots, who had effectively been purged from their homeland by the vindictive policies of Louis XIV. The French king saw state-sanctioned toleration of a Protestant minority, which stretched back to the time of Henry of Navarre, to be a weakness, and thus in 1685 he decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes, not least because he was so keen to win the highly coveted honorific of being regarded as the most Christian king in Europe, a title only the Pope could bestow. Raising taxes and billeting the fearsome dragonards on Huguenot households became intolerable and led to widespread emigration. Many fled to Russia, as well as Britain, and quickly joined the army to join the fight against their mother country. As shocking as Louis's actions were towards the Huguenots, they can at least be understood as part of Louis's wider efforts to centralise and unify a disparate and fragmented country around his person, according to the long-established principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. What was less understandable was his actions towards the Jansenists. Unlike the Huguenots, the Jansenists were a committed group within the Roman Catholic Church. But this small sect's belief in predestination and their emphasis on the need for divine grace savoured of Calvinism, and Louis was determined to extirpate their alleged heresy. Louis XIV focused his eye on the Port Royal, a celebrated abbey of Cistercian monks, which had become the centre of Jansenist teaching. Port Royal was razed to the ground, and the graves of prominent Jansenists were desecrated. But persecution by the state only served to harden their resistance and deepen their commitment to their faith. Thus, in 1713, Louis asked Pope Clement XI to issue a papal bull that denounced Jansenism as a form of heresy. This understandably angered Jansenists in the Paris Parlement, but it also angered French Gallicans, who also sat in the magistracy. They believed in the absolute primacy of the French Church to make its own laws without outside influence from Rome. The king invoking papal authority to resolve a domestic issue within the French Church only served to alienate a crucial phalanx with the French Parlement and raised fundamental questions about the king's claims to be truly absolute. Unigenitus was to have a significant long-term impact into the 18th century and was just one of many things that began to reshape Parlement and recalibrate its relationship with the crown by the time of the king's death. Where once they'd been self-serving and relatively supine, by 1715 they'd begun to voice the type of proto-constitutional ambitions that had long lain dormant. Perhaps it was the fading memories of the Fronde, or the emerging success of the English parliamentary system. But it was clear that if Louis's successors wanted to embark on a programme of reform in the future, then they would need to negotiate with an invigorated and emboldened Parlement that would prove to be much less pliable than its forebears had been under Louis XIV. A recalcitrant Parlement, energised by the indignities of Unigenitus, was just one aspect of Louis's legacy to his successors. Richard Wilkinson might claim that there is now no sympathy for the idea that Louis XIV can be held responsible for the French Revolution. But a case can be made that seeds were sown during the reign of the Sun King that grew into the socio-political chaos that beset France from 1789 onwards. Louis's predilection for war, allied to his willingness to maintain fiscal privileges of the clergy and the nobility, meant that by the end of his reign, he had bequeathed a debt of 2 billion livres to his great-grandson, the boy who would become Louis XV. It was clear by 1715 that an absolutist monarchy that prioritised the pursuit of la gloire and paid for it through venality, i.e. the sale of offices, was just not sustainable in the long term, and that structural reform would have to be embraced by his successors if they were to stave off bankruptcy. However, any attempts to tackle the system of privilege and reform the fiscal system would inevitably run into difficulties with the privileged orders sat in an increasingly hostile Parlement. To make matters worse, Louis's propaganda offensive at Versailles served to forge a rigid template for his successors as to exactly what an absolute monarchy should look like. Whether or not they were temperamentally suited to this specific brand of absolutist kingship, they would still be expected to rule in the manner of the Grand Monarch, even as the 18th century zeitgeist began to evolve in a way that eventually rendered divine right absolutism anachronistic by mid-century. Thank you for watching today. I hope you found it useful and interesting. In our next video, we're going to be thinking about the regency of Louis XV and some of the decisions made by Orleans and Fleury in the king's stead. We're going to be thinking about how divine right absolutism was rendered increasingly anachronistic as Louis XV struggled to live up to the expectations of the Sun King. Thanks very much.